For my research project, I decided to research adolescents in the workforce. And the reason I decided to do this was because I started working at age 14 and I never really knew what all went into it or what kind of hoops my employers had to jump through in order to give me a job. So I thought it'd be really interesting to learn about what they had to do in order to let me work. And I also was recently offered a manager's position, and one of my responsibilities is going to be hiring. And we are allowed to hire adolescents under 16, so I thought it would be important for me to learn all of the laws and regulations and the rights that minors have when it comes to working. The topics that I wanted to look into for my project were the child labor laws and how those have changed from the beginning of our country to now. I also wanted to look into who benefits most from hiring minors. Is that the employee or the employer? And I also wanted to look into what motivations people had when they joined the workforce as adolescents. The first thing I'm going to be talking about is child labor laws at the beginning of our country and how those have changed.
Adolescents have been servants and apprentices throughout most of human history, but child labor itself reached all new highs during the Industrial Revolution. The children were useful as laborers because of their size. They could do things most grown adults could not do, and they were also a lot easier to control.
The owners of these factories, farms, mines, and other places that these children found work during the Industrial Revolution could pay them less than they would pay an adult. It was also very unlikely that they would unionize. So these employers knew that children didn't know their rights and that they didn't have very many, and they took advantage of it. Educational reformers set out to change this. In the mid-19th century, they started working on convincing the public that a primary education was necessary for their children. Without a primary education, how could these children move forward personally, and how could they help our country move forward in the future? This push by educational reformers led many states to create a minimum time required for adolescents to go to school. There was a problem with these new laws, though. There were a lot of loopholes, and in a lot of states they were very laxly enforced. So oftentimes children were still working full-time and not going to school. In 1904, the National Child Labor Committee was formed, and they were the leaders in the forefront for the push to regulate or even eliminate child labor. This committee used a lot of different tactics to kind of inspire a public outrage. They would interview professionals, and they would go in with photographers and take pictures of these horrid conditions where the children were working. They oftentimes passed out pamphlets or leaflets or sent out mailers that would show all of these conditions and how little these children were being paid. However, despite these efforts, the change really depended on the political climate and what kind of things were going on in the country at the time. When the Great Depression hit, the movement to end child labor really flourished. The Great Depression wasn't great for the country, but it was great for the movement to eliminate child labor. A lot of these people wanted jobs to go to able working adults instead of children. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. This put regulations on child labor. It also put into effect that children under the age of 16 were prohibited from working in manufacturing, mining, and other dangerous jobs. In America today, there are a lot of laws and regulations that protect minors when they start to enter the workforce. There are a lot of state and federal regulations in place to protect minors when they start to enter the workforce. However, there are a few federal regulations that are stricter than the ones that we have here in Utah. If the federal regulations apply to the employer, then the employer must follow the stricter regulations instead of the ones that Utah has set in place. Under Utah law, minors who are under the age of 16 are permitted to work 4-hour shifts on a school day. If they are under 16, they are also not allowed to work past 9:30 on a night where they have school the next day. Federal law is only slightly different than the one in Utah. If a minor is under the age of 16, they are only allowed to work 3-hour shifts a day. They are also not allowed to work past 7 p.m. from Labor Day to June 1st, and past 9:30 p.m. from June 1st to Labor Day. Minors in Utah are able to work in the restaurant industry, do office work, work in retail, and do other non-dangerous positions. Certain types of jobs like newspaper delivery, babysitting, and other odd jobs like that are able to be performed by a younger group of adolescents. These child labor laws also prohibit that minors under the age of 18 are not allowed to work in any hazardous conditions. This includes things like construction. Some states require that employers get a permit in order to hire minors. However, Utah is not one of those states. Employers may hire minors without receiving a permit. The only time a permit would be required is for a job that has odd hours or varies from the rules and regulations. An example of this would be like acting. An aspect of this project I found really interesting was looking into who benefits the most from hiring adolescents, the employee or the employer. I decided to interview 2 people in my life who are in charge of hiring. The first person that I decided to interview was my uncle. He is a manager at a local Red Robin, and one of his responsibilities is hiring. When I asked him about hiring minors, he said he prefers to hire people over the age of 16. Minors are often his biggest group of applicants, and he has no problem with hiring minors. But the problem is hiring someone who is 15, which is allowed by his company, can make a lot of people's jobs harder. Their restaurant can get really busy, and sometimes the minor who's under 16 can get lost in the shuffle. This can cause them to work them longer than is allowed, or for them to get more hours than they are allowed. It not only makes his job harder, it makes the person in charge of the schedule's job harder because they have to figure out how to fit them in for just 4-hour shifts a day. And with a busy industry like that, he just said it was better to hire someone who was able to work just whenever they could. He said they did have a situation where they hired a 15-year-old, but the problem was they switched managers every night and they never could keep track of how many hours he was working. So in this situation, I think it can go both ways. I think if he's hiring a minor that's over the age of 16, then it benefits both parties. But if he was to hire someone who was younger than 16, then it would benefit the minor more than it would benefit. The next person I decided to interview was my old manager at a Shave Ice Shack that I worked at. I started working there when I was 15 years old, and I continued to work there until I was 15. I was only allowed to work 4-hour shifts, and I couldn't work the closing shifts while school was still in session. Once school ended, however, I was able to work the closing shift, but only in 4-hour increments. My old manager told me that hiring minors was something that her manager wanted her to do. The man who started this company started it because he wanted to find a way for adolescents to have a job. He thought it was important that teens get work experience and were able to build their resumes. She did say figuring out how to work around the laws took a lot of getting used to, but once she figured it out, it was pretty easy. She did have to hire a bigger staff than would be needed if we were all over the age of 16, just because she had to make sure that there was enough people to continually be working since a lot of us could only work 4 hours. After interviewing her, I think in this situation, hiring minors benefits both the employer and the employee because the minor gets work experience while the employer is able to keep their job. The last topic that I decided to look into was people's motivation behind joining the workforce. In order to do this research, I decided to interview a few of my peers at work and ask them what made them decide to start working when they were out. It was really interesting because I got a lot of different responses, but a lot of them were also very similar. There was a group of my coworkers that said their peers were the ones that influenced them to work, and they saw this as a positive. Said they were motivated to begin working when they saw that their peers had all this money to spend and they didn't have to ask their parents for an allowance. A lot of them also said they decided to join the workforce so that they could work with their friends at the same job. There was also a group who said they were influenced by their peers, but they saw this as a negative influence. They grew up in a wealthier school district, and in their school they saw all of their peers getting opportunities and doing all these activities because their parents had money. So they decided to start working so they could have their own money to be able to keep up with their peers. So they were working just to be able to try to fit in. The final response that I got from people was that they were self-motivated to find a job. They wanted to feel a sense of independence from their parents and to be able to spend their own money. They also were really motivated to move out once they turned 18 and graduated. So that is why they started to enter the workforce. I found that really interesting because in my personal experience, what motivated me was my parents and my peers. I wanted to work so I could spend money and have fun with my friends because I didn't get a very big allowance from my parents. So I decided I was going to enter the workforce at 14 and start saving money so that way I could buy a car and eventually pay for my own college education. Learning about all the different aspects of adolescence entering the workforce was really interesting. I'm really glad that now I know the rights that minors have when it comes to entering the workforce and all the regulations that go into them working. I'm also really glad to know who benefits the most from hiring minors, and that even though sometimes it has a negative connotation, hiring minors can be beneficial to both the employer and the employee. I also really enjoyed asking my coworkers about how they decided to enter the workforce and how that differed from my experience. It was really interesting to see how all of our experiences were similar in some way. A lot of it about gaining independence or wanting to fit in or being able to do stuff without having to ask for money. This project was really interesting, and I am glad that now I am more educated on this topic, and so I can go into my future jobs being able to know how to hire minors and what their rights are.